Hello and welcome to The Agenda on Labour Social. I'm Graham Hughes, and today I am joined by George Revel, who is a legal academic specialising in international law in democratic states. And I hesitate, is Britain still classified as a democratic state, George?
Oh, by international standards, absolutely.
Okay, phew. Anyway, we had George on one of our episodes of Three Blokes in the Pub back in, 2018, was
18.
it?
Yep.
2018, back when we thought that we could actually stop Brexit. Oh, what sweet summer children we were, George.
There was hope.
Yeah,
It was the autumn, and there was hope.
yeah. But you know a lot more about the law than I do. And so I've asked you to come on here and kind of explain what the hell has happened this week with, let me get this right. So the Cabinet Office, which is kind of not civil servants, but it is civil servants, but it's headed up by Oliver Dowden, who is the Deputy Prime Minister. They're refusing to hand over WhatsApp messages from Boris Johnson, but Boris Johnson has said that he would hand over the messages once he's checked the ones that are getting sent, so he's not sending ones that are incriminate him in any way. And Baroness, what's her name?
Hallett.
Hallett. Baroness Hallett, who's heading up the COVID inquiry, has been in a situation now where they've given them two deadlines that they missed, and then the last deadline ended this week on Thursday at 4:00. That's flown by, and now both the Cabinet Office and the COVID inquiry are threatening to take each other to court to get to keep the WhatsApp messages secret, or to get the WhatsApp messages. Is that it?
Uh, there's a couple of issues there. In the interest of accuracy, I'd say that. So the actual WhatsApp messages make up one half of what's being requested. So the way this process occurs, the inquiry set up under the Inquiries Act 2005. There are specific powers that the chair of any such inquiry set up under that has under what's called Section 21. Essentially, any chair of any inquiry is going to request relevant information.
Okay.
Now, given the nature of what was going on during the lockdowns, during the pandemic itself, as everyone was often saying, well, this is an unprecedented situation. Well, it certainly was technologically as well. Many people were venturing into new ways of communicating, and as often happens, technology outpaces the law any day of the week. I can't think of a time where the law has preempted a particular controversy with technology. WhatsApp's just one of them. It was convenient.
Yes.
It was a matter. It was something that could be set up very quickly.
Because this is an issue, isn't it? Whether they should have been using WhatsApp for government business, and there's some people saying, well, obviously not. But then it was quite unprecedented, the situation they were in.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there are normal ways of operating within the structure of how the British state is actually run and administered. The civil services there. I was listening to an interview with John Sopel on the news agents, and he was talking about the notion of whenever you have conversations, even if they're private conversations, with a minister, there's going to be a principal private secretary who's there, who's a part of the civil service, who is going to keep notes and have a record of who they met with, the nature of the communication, and these all become official record.
Yeah.
The problem with third-party messaging apps or social media apps is that these are outside the normal scope of communications, which, again, given the unprecedented nature, it was important to get communication lines up and running.
But surely they should have had a more secure way of doing it with all the resources you would assume the government of the fifth biggest economy in the world had it at its disposal, instead of using a free app.
Are we still the fifth? I thought India overtook.
Seventh.
Yeah.
I don't know. At the time, maybe we were the fifth. But I mean, we were still a big economy. The government's got a lot of money. You would expect them to not be using a free app to communicate, one that literally anyone with a phone number that was in the group could then screenshot.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a couple
Isabel
of things.
shot.
I actually don't even think it's necessarily a matter of money. I think it's very much a matter of accountability. Um, it's a culture of accountability that has to take root. And when you're operating as a government, you should have at the core of what you do the idea that you do live in a democratic state, that you are elected by the people, and that you are accountable to them. Now, that doesn't mean everything that is ever said or done is going to be subject to public scrutiny. There's certain oversight that exists. It's the same in America. It's the same in Canada. Certain committees are set up to make sure that any operations that are going on do have some level of accountability, whether it be directly to the public, through the judiciary, through a judicial process, or um, through the elected representatives of the people.
Yeah.
So, for instance, in the United States, when it comes to certain national security issues, you have committees set up within Congress that, essentially, whether let's say, for instance, intelligence operations, the heads of those agencies or specific people, deputy heads in certain intelligence agencies, they have to go before these committees and answer questions.
Yeah.
There is a degree of accountability. Now, how do you have that accountability? Well, in a rational sense, you always have to have evidence based. No one's going to remember verbatim what they said 2 years ago. I mean, the scope of this inquiry starts with regards to the notice that was served.
Yeah.
The specific dates are the 1st January 2020 through to, I believe it's February 24th, 2022.
Yeah.
You're not going to remember every single thing. That's why it's important to have records. And in order to afford accountability, these records have to be kept in a manner consistent with the process that it's going to be subjected to. Prior to the notion of using things like WhatsApp, these systems existed, whether it was the civil service or document keeping, the surrendering of things.
Well,
The problem
this
that we
is it.
have,
I mean, if any other company has a meeting, they have minutes, don't they? If someone takes minutes from the meetings, but you can't get that with WhatsApp. And
well,
but
well, you can, but the problem is that, and this is where a lot of this issue is going to come up, is like, if WhatsApp isn't controlled by the framework of government,
yeah, yeah,
it comes down to the reliance on the individual to hand over the
yeah.
pertinent information. Now, as you said from the outset, at first it seemed that they weren't going to hand them over. Then Boris Johnson comes around and says, "I'll hand them directly to you."
Yeah.
And the reason being is he's saying that, oh, I have the records, I can give them to you. The objection from the
Yeah, but
cabinet
he's
office
also
has been,
said that he wants to check them first and decide what ones are relevant, which I think is very important because when we talk about meetings, all right, so any given meeting, I would assume that people would say hello and ask how how the weekend was or whatever before the meeting starts, and then in the minutes that just says greetings. It doesn't say like exactly verbatim what they said at that point because it wasn't important to the topic of the meeting. So you're gonna have messages like that that aren't really relevant at all. But I don't see how any way that is the purview of the person who said or sent the message to decide what's relevant or not.
and that again is a very good point to make. Is the idea that who is the ultimate arbiter, the final arbiter of what is relevant to the evidentiary for the inquiry. Um, in her ruling, so the cabinet office issued a challenge under Section 21(4) to the inquiry in response to the notice they received, and in that they said, we have these robust systems for determining what is, and I'm seeing if I can remember the term correctly here, but what is essentially irrelevant. Um, and they try to set out this notion that we have this robust process by which we determine what is ultimately irrelevant to your inquiry. And we'll hand over those things that we determine not to be irrelevant.
Yeah.
Um, and they suggested that we've provided you some samples of how this works. Now, ultimately, in some of these redactions that occur, um, they'll provide reasons why a specific item has been redacted. They claim that they are constantly reviewing what's been redacted for relevance, and where there's a redaction, the inquiry can query the cabinet office to determine why it was redacted in the first place. Um, Ultimately, Baroness Hallett rejected that and said outright that even on the basis of what has already been handed over in relation to the other person that was subject to that notice, Henry Cook, who was an advisor to Boris Johnson. She said, ultimately, even what I've had so far, there have been multiple instances where, well, that is not as robust a system as you think it is. And
Mm.
ultimately, as a matter of the scope of this specific inquiry, it is by its very nature quite a broad scope that we are afforded, because in order to make the recommendations going forward, we need to know the context of it. I mean, not they don't specifically say context. That's my word, but I would definitely say that um, some of the representations she makes in a ruling definitely point to the idea that uh, in order to understand uh, whether or not things were being communicated properly, how policy was being determined, you ultimately have to know that the environment and the context in which those decisions were being made. Um, in order to do so, you certainly have to have access to things that may not, at first blush, appear to be relevant. Um, and this seems to be the line of argument that the Cabinet Office is going down, saying, we decide what's relevant, not you. And she is responding back by saying, actually, no, I am the one. I am
Yeah.
the final arbiter. Even the government's
But it's
response is,
it's worth noting as well, George, that this is a inquiry that was set up by the Conservative government. Like they
indeed.
set up this inquiry. Did they choose? Um,
Actually, it was Boris Johnson's government that
yeah,
specifically
yeah. But I mean,
set it up.
yeah. But the Tories, the people in charge at the moment,
Mhm.
they like to pretend that it's been a new party every couple of years, but actually it's the same people.
Uh,
Um,
You know what? It's iterations of the same party. I mean, the idea being, of course, that it's not one individual. Sure, you can have different leaders of a party, but the
mm,
party is the party in a parliamentary system the way we have it. So, but no, what I was going to say though is that with regards to uh, with regards to the idea of acknowledging that that Baroness Hallett is the ultimate arbiter of what is relevant and is not. Even the government's uh, submissions in challenging her notice even say, yes, we recognize that you are the ultimate arbiter, but we're going to arbitrate prior to you having the final arbitration. But
what?
again,
That's
yeah,
not being a final arbiter then. That's like
no, I mean, you can only you can only be the arbiter on information that you know exists.
so.
And
I know you probably don't want to get into speculation because you deal with the law, but why would a government not want to hand over those notes unless there's something incriminating in there? And what sort of things would be concerning the government at this point? Not forgetting that I know it's a public inquiry, but the full results won't be known until 2026, and also I guess that they will not have to hand over any of this information beforehand if they feel like it's not pertinent to the inquiry.
so, sorry, when you say they won't hand it over, do you mean the inquiry or do you mean the
The
cabinet
inquiry
office?
won't publish the stuff that they consider, irrelevant to the inquiry. But I mean, what could be in there theoretically that would be giving the cabinet office and the government pause to be handing this stuff over?
So, I again, the notion of speculating as to why they're motivated to challenge this. I can't answer that. What I can say is that the nature of governance, there's always going to be communications that may be subject to certain aspects of policy and privacy that have to be there, and without giving a full throated endorsement of it, far from it, I would say that this idea that you don't want to create a certain precedent for the handing over, that there has to be a certain um, comfort level that the government has to have, that they can have open discussions, open, frank, and honest discussions without the fear that you're going to end up having your specific words attributed to you. I mean, Chatham House, it's where the Chatham House rule comes from. Is this idea that we can have open and frank discussions, but there's no attribution to specific individuals, so that we can actually speak openly and freely. Now,
Yeah,
that's an important thing that anybody who wants to pursue anything that may have controversy, you have to have that.
Do you think
That
that's the case though for the rest of us, for us little people? Because anything that we say in a recorded Zoom conversation now is recorded on Zoom forever. Whether or not you have the authority.
well,
but,
I mean,
but
even not the little people. I mean, as a matter of policy for corporates, um, especially since the pandemic and since
mm,
remote working has become a thing, many corporate entities are cracking down on the use of third party messaging.
yeah.
They'll have policies in place that say, because of the nature of our work, and I mean, we're not
Yeah.
even talking about democracies here. We're talking about just corporate
But
structures.
what's
They will say,
in
you cannot use WhatsApp to discuss business.
in
We
in
can't control that.
in terms of sort of international law in democratic societies? What's the thinking behind the Chatham House rules, behind this idea that you should be able to speak freely and no one finds out about it for 30 years, because the 30-year rule in the UK on the disclosure of public documentation, things like that. But I mean, is that the idea, like, oh well, if they can discuss it in cabinet and then no one knows what they were talking about, you just get the edited highlights, I guess. Does that stop people from having informal discussions in the pub instead? Is that the idea? Because I'm sure they do that anyway.
Um, so first thing I would highlight is the notion that it's uncontroversial and it's agreed on both sides that anything that is quote unquote national security sensitive will be redacted.
Yes.
Um, Baroness Hallett's accepted that, and there is by the nature of the fact that you're part of the government of the United Kingdom, those conversations are going to occur whichever forum you're in.
Yeah.
She cannot be privy to it because it may be something that cannot be openly spoken about, as you say, whether it's under the 30-year rule or whatever reason being that they cannot discuss it. That has to exist. Um, that's not the nature of what these redactions are. The the way that things are being discussed, the reason why you need to be able to discuss matters openly is that in order to at least try and be across the board as to whatever challenges may be coming your way, sometimes you do have to think about the unthinkable. You have to have an open discussion about hypothetical threats or threats that may actually not be so hypothetical, and you
Yeah.
have to have a very frank conversation and consider all options. That's the only way that you can come to sort of some salient policy that can react to the reality that you're going to face. Now, if you have a situation where um, you're ultimately going to end up in front of an inquiry, and it's the breadth that's the issue here. So while I don't think they're necessarily arguing that things related specifically to COVID are going to be part of those redactions, what
Yeah.
they're saying is this request wasn't specifically for that. This is so broad as to say this may involve, she wants the full unredacted WhatsApp messages, which could cover any myriad of things. I mean, it's kind of ironic that some of this comes down to arguments where they're saying, oh, this could violate Article 8, ECHR rights to privacy of
Oh.
certain individuals who may be commenting.
Oh,
I
so
mean,
so they're violating European rights then, yeah.
well, I mean, actually, no, that's a very good point because what you have is the European Convention on Human Rights, but it applies in the United Kingdom under the Human Rights Act.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's kind of an important thing to have in the conversation is this idea that ultimately, if we're going to talk about this country as a democracy, one of the key aspects of a democracy has to be the rule of law. The rule of law as it is. Now, it might seem on its face hypocritical that you're going to have people who are championing the abolition of the Human Rights Act and to replace it with a British Bill of Rights that,
Mm.
I mean, the draft I saw that was introduced by Dominic Raab leaves a lot to be desired.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but like that is their right, and any lawyer advising them is going to say, well, if we're going to put forward an argument, if there's grounds to do so, we should make arguments on the Human Rights Act grounds, which are the ECHR grounds.
Yeah.
So, and there is a certain argument about the privacy of certain individuals who are caught up in amongst all of this. Um, but then that does lead me to the question of, well, if these are the official channels or these are the unofficial parallel channels in which key decisions were being made at a time of great crisis in the United Kingdom, why are you having individual personal conversations interspersed in these official
Yes.
channels?
Yeah, that's a really good
You
point.
know, like the convenience of having WhatsApp can also be the bane of any argument that says, oh well, we also had other conversations that were, I think I saw something that said it includes certain, it may involve junior staff in terms of disciplinary procedures. And I'm going, well, why is that being discussed in the COVID-19 group
Yeah.
chat?
Well, exactly.
Um,
Well, this is something that I wanted to bring up. I mean, like, I don't really see why, unless they're discussing national security issues, I don't see why our elected representatives don't have it in the back of their head. Anything they say on the record while in office, in a meeting, on a WhatsApp, or, whatever, being recorded, they could be hauled in front of an inquiry in the future for saying it. I don't have a problem with that because I think that would keep them in line,
oh,
uh, discourage
it's
them from doing illegal stuff or
well,
suggesting illegal stuff.
I would almost flip what you just said into its inverse and say that it actually encourages a certain type of conduct while in office. And I think that's something that's, and this isn't specifically restricted to the Conservatives. This is for any
Yes.
politician that's elected. You should have you should be encouraging um, a culture defined by the idea of accountability
Yes.
and compliance with not just the law, the specific laws, but also
Yeah.
the nature of the Constitution
Well,
of the United Kingdom.
if police officers are having to have body cameras for their interactions with people to prove in a possible upcoming inquiry that they didn't break the law in what they did, I think
Mm.
that's something that our elected officials, that should be day one. I'm not saying they should all wear body cameras, but I'm saying that any discussion, like even cabinet level discussions, as long as they're not, they can block it out if they're discussing national security stuff. But otherwise, I think it should be available on parliamentary TV so we can see what discussions are leading to the decisions that they make, and we can be a part of that. Because otherwise, it is just an elected dictatorship. We elect them every 5 years, and then they sit in the ivory tower
Well,
and decide what's best for us, and we never get to see the working out.
that's what I was going to get to. There was the idea that it is indirectly subjected to scrutiny by the public in the sense that cabinet decisions ultimately, the point of having them is to develop policy. That policy has to be presented before Parliament. The accountability in that sense is, okay, you can come up with a policy in the cabinet office. It might be lunatic, it might be brilliant, whatever it may be. You then have to march down the street. You have to walk over from Whitehall over to Westminster, and you have to put that before the people's representatives, who will sit there, scrutinize it. Whether
That's supposed
they'll
to.
suggest they'll suggest amendments. I mean, there's been a lot to say about. Um, I know that one of the issues that Labour wants to bring up is the idea of House of Lords reform or
Yes.
replacement. Um, I think there's something to be said without getting into the larger issue there. Um, when you look at some ways that the House of Lords actually acts as a counterbalance to some of the more extreme positions that are taken in the House of Commons. Now, the argument there is, well, you're not democratically elected. You're undermining the democratic legitimacy of how we
Mhm.
govern ourselves as an unelected body. Again, as I say, that's a larger issue, and there is a conversation to be had. But in certain specific instances, you can definitely sit there and say they are exercising a very vital role in um, let's say, softening the edges of some rather hard policies that have been coming out recently. Um, in some regards, some of it can result in delays. I mean, the Parliament Acts allow or limit the ability of the House of Lords to prevent bills from going through.
Yeah.
Um, that's an aspect of democratic control, so they can only delay for so long. They can't actually block anything. All they can do is delay it. So whatever the suggestions that come down from the House of Lords ultimately aren't ones where they're directly interfering with a specific law. What they're doing is they're making suggestions.
Mm.
They're making very powerful suggestions that are publicly available. That if hypothetically you had an 80-seat majority and you actually didn't have to compromise on anything. Um, it's rather powerful when everybody else in both chambers
Yeah.
raises it as an issue and puts it in the public, and the public starts sitting there. And I don't care if you have an 80-seat majority. This is a country of nigh on 68 million people. Um,
Yes.
that's a lot more than
But
the seats that the
what
government have.
what I was getting at more is the fact that, okay, yeah, they present this policy to Parliament and then it gets scrutinised, etc. But I think that not being able to see the discussion that led up to the formulation of the policy, I don't think that's right. I think we should be able to see that as well. And if there is a line in there saying, well, I do get lobbied a lot by the oil industry, by the firearms industry, by the tobacco industry, and this would really help my mates in that respect. If they say something
Oh,
like that in a meeting, I want to know. I want to know that that's the
I, I
motivation
would
behind the policy
I
rather
would
than
expect. I mean, first of all, we all know that there are issues with the register of interests,
yes,
particularly in terms of the timeliness of their publications. I think that's a system that there shouldn't be a lot of wiggle room. I mean, if you do have contributions, or or you're receiving anything of favor, I think you should have a 7-day policy. And outside that 7 days, it should be a sanctionable offense for any politician not to have registered that interest. Um, I tempering the notion of cynicism here. I would definitely say that I don't think anyone ever sits in a room and says, hey, can we do this policy because I received 20,000 quid from some oil company? I think, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not that, for lack of a better term, thick. Uh, Everyone would kind of go, yeah, I don't think that's an
okay.
appropriate thing to
I'm
say.
not
But,
saying it would be overt, but like if a member of the cabinet said, "Hey, we want to think about giving an extra £50 million to Shell this week because we can," and then we find out subsequently that representative, that cabinet member, was on the board of Shell, we'll be able to put two and two together ourselves. So they wouldn't need to say it overtly. We've got, okay, well, that's why they wanted this bill.
well, this is why I would come back to the idea of the rule of law. So there's a big difference between the suggestion of something and the evidence of something. Um, Ultimately, the inquiry, like I would almost say, like, focusing in on the pandemic, a lot of what we've seen is speculation. Everybody's been speculating since the start of the pandemic. Um, this is where we have this
There's some people
flourishing
who
of
think that it
conspiracy.
wasn't real, George. They
Oh,
think
absolutely,
it
but that's
wasn't
what I'm getting.
real and the
That's what I'm
world is
getting at.
flat and the moon is made of cheese and and 2 years after your injection, your vaccination, you just dropped dead. That's what
Oh,
I
I've
heard.
been told that too. I find
Yeah,
that,
I'm still here.
but it's important that we get to the idea of where this comes from, and where this comes from is the absence of information. So, in the
Also,
absence of it,
absence of brain power for some people, but yeah, I go.
well, I mean, while I might vociferously disagree with a lot of conspiracy theorists, there's a certain aspect of human thinking there, the desire for understanding, but that ultimately, whatever conclusion you come to, is going to be based on how much evidence you have. Like, relating it back to what we're talking about here about the production of these messages and these notebooks. The idea is that for the inquiry to actually reach uh, a defensible position in terms of making recommendations. There's specific, like, with regards to the pandemic, it was known that we were going to have a global pandemic at some point, and then it came along. Um, it wasn't the first one. I know that similar inquiries were made after the outbreaks of
Yeah,
SARS, and of MERS, and the reason being is that mistakes were made. We are only human. We will make mistakes.
yeah.
In order to mitigate the humanity of that, we have to examine it, look at the evidence, and see what we did wrong, what we did right, what we can improve on.
Mm.
That's what this inquiry is supposed to be. You know, over 220,000 people have died.
Yep.
It, you know,
In this
in
country.
you have, yeah, exactly. Well, specifically in the UK, it's over 220,000, maybe 225 now, I think.
Yeah.
I was looking at the numbers maybe a week ago, and you look at that and you go, people want answers. That's why this
Yeah.
inquiry was set up. The bereaved families and friends of people that were lost need to understand that was there something that could have been done better, and B, should this occur again? And it will
It
happen
will
again.
happen
It's not a
again.
question of if;
Yeah.
it's a question of when.
Yeah.
In order for us to be prepared properly, we need to actually examine the evidence itself as opposed to speculating. So
True.
when there's this vacuum of information, it's filled with speculation, and the
Well,
speculation occurs in conspiracy theories, but it also occurs in instances like this where, well, you asked a legitimate question and saying, well, what reasons could they have for not wanting this information to be public?
yeah.
Well, there's a myriad of reasons, but if they're not going to come out and specifically nominate what those reasons were, it's fair game for a lot of people to sit there and say, well, I bet it's embarrassing for so and so, or I bet,
Yeah.
like we all remember some of the fallout from Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages being given out,
Given
although
to
it was a
Isabel
complete.
Oakeshott for some
Well, I
reason.
mean, it wasn't even the first person she burned as a source.
I
So,
know.
um,
She seems so trustworthy.
well, I mean, in those instances, not even specifically in Matt Hancock, but I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but the first time you touch a hot element on a range, you learn that it's hot and you don't
Yeah.
put your hand back.
Yeah.
Some people don't learn that. Sometimes they go back 5 or 6 times and they keep going, why does this keep happening to me? And you go, you're not learning. Well, I mean, this is almost on point because you're saying, well, you didn't learn the lesson.
Do you know
Like,
the episode of The Simpsons with Sideshow Bob in where he stands on the rakes and every step he takes he stands on another rake and the rake hits him in the face and it goes on and on. I think they actually did it because the episode wasn't long enough and they had to like
oh,
pad out the
time.
episode. That was the
Yeah,
reason
yeah,
they did it. But comedy gold, and also that's the Conservative Party right now. It's like every time they take a step forward, rake in the face. They turn around, rake in the face. And like how stupid are these people running the country? And when we
Well,
talk about speculation, there's something to be said that, like, at the time, like, we took our kids out of school a week before the actual lockdown because we
yeah,
said, look, this is getting ridiculous. We were looking at the figures coming out of places like Italy, and we're like, we're not sending the kids to school this week
that would have
because,
been March 16th.
yeah. So we were like ahead, and then it came out not just about the PPE, which we found out sort of at the time. There were stories coming out about companies getting PPE contracts that shouldn't be getting those things. At the time when the bounce back loans were going out, there were companies that were literally being set up and getting the bounce back loan immediately that afternoon and then disappearing. So that was obvious from the get go. It's not something that we need an inquiry to go, oh, yeah, that was a bad idea. But also there was the pandemic response. They had a what's it called, like a wargaming scenario where they
Yeah,
went
back
through
in 2016.
2016,
I can't remember the name of the operation,
and
but
and and
but
they
they
said
wargamed
that
it.
the
Yeah.
one thing was they needed more PPE. We had a shortage of PPE in this wargaming
Oh, but
scenario
when they
of
opened
having
up
a
the stock,
pandemic.
yeah, when they opened up the stockpiles, like full disclosure, I mean, I have family, very close family that were frontline healthcare providers, and this was a very real threat to them. I mean, um, the sleeplessness I had was the notion that whereas I could sit here and say I'm locked down. Uh, More of my concern was the notion that I had family members that I knew were risking it every day.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
they were people with who themselves had what they call comorbidities and ailments that made them particularly susceptible. That if they caught COVID, would have been disastrous for them. But kudos to them on the notion that they went to work. They just said, look, what I need the protection. I need the gear. To this day, the product, like the sort of, there had built up this sort of complacency amongst some of my family members who said, up until the pandemic, yeah, they would see patients without putting on a mask, without, because it was just regular GP visits. But post pandemic, well, no, this is a healthcare setting now. This is somewhere where we take precautions, whether
yeah,
it's to prevent catching something from a patient, or and this is definitely where the emphasis is transmitting something to a patient that they've got off another patient.
yeah.
So it is about this notion of doing that. But with regards to the PPE, was it a month ago or so? They burned £1 billion worth of PPE, is
Something
what
like
I've
that,
heard.
yeah, because it was.
Um, and even in the war game scenario that you were talking about, um,
Oh,
oh,
you're back.
sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, no, in relation to the, what was I saying there? In relation to the wargaming scenario, uh, they specifically said that the stockpiles that they did have of PPE um, would expire, or some of it had already expired. And that was the problem is that, it doesn't last forever. You can't just buy one bulk purchase,
Yeah,
throw it in a warehouse and expect that when you open it up 15 years later, that it's going to have the same efficacy as if it had been made,
yeah,
within that time period. But again, this goes back, sort of tying it back into what the general subject is of what we're talking about. Again, this is about, accountability, and how do you achieve accountability? You have to achieve it by actually gathering evidence and acting on evidence, as opposed
yeah.
to feelings. And the problem is that I feel that a lot of the system right now is based on feeling. I'm not saying that you take the humanity out of it.
The
There's
system, you
always,
mean the way we respond to
yeah, I
events?
mean, the way that we organize ourselves, the way that we engage with not just our fellow, like, those on the same side of the fence as us, but also those on the other side.
Well,
Um,
I often equate Brexit with, a crime of passion. I don't see there was any logic in it whatsoever. It was pure emotion.
one of my
And
one of my friends who actually works for uh, a conservative party in another country, um, who I went to law school with. Um, we have conversations about this all the time because we're ideologically on the other sides from each other.
mm,
But we find it important to have reasonable conversations about policy, even if it's just amongst ourselves. And I will sit there and say, this is the argument that I would go with. This is the way I perceive certain situations, whether it's Brexit, whether it was the Scottish referendum in 2014. Um, I think that there is a way that you can have reasonable, intelligent conversations. And his rebuttal was, yeah, but when people walk into the ballot box, they're not thinking with their head, they think with their heart.
yeah,
He goes, that
yeah,
decision is made on, for lack of a better term, the gut feeling. He
yeah,
goes, you can explain the logic of something, and it will take whatever time it takes. I go on at length, but sometimes somebody can get the same message across in, let's say, 10 minutes in a
yeah.
conversation. Um,
But
he goes, you've got about 30 seconds.
yeah,
He goes, that's the way politics works. So you've got
which
30
is
seconds,
which is
and then
why
feelings kick in.
yeah, which is why I don't like personality politics, and I prefer people to I would prefer people to vote on policy rather than whether they like someone or not. And if you think of it like Hillary Clinton versus Boris Johnson, for instance, they are two absolutely 100% diametrically opposed personalities. People in America said, I don't like Hillary. You say, why? And they go, I don't know. I just don't like her. Over here, they say, Boris Johnson, I like him. And you're like, but he's a philanderer, he's a creep, he's a liar, he's a cheat. Yeah, I don't know why. I can't explain it. I just like him. And that's a huge problem with the functioning of I was going to say British society, societies all around the world.
Mm.
If we're going to fall into this sort of personality trap of voting via emotion rather than voting for the best person.
Well, I think another thing that comes into it, and off the top where you were asking the question about, is Britain still a democratic country? I think there's a certain complacency that comes from having a stable democracy. Um, you know, uh, I grew up in Canada. Um, in terms of my teenage years and being aware of society and politics, uh, I more or less had the same government with the same leader all through my teenage years. Jean Chrétien. We had a country where, or we had a situation where our politics was one in which the distance between the Conservatives and the Liberal Party, which is the parallel to Labour here, the distance between these two parties was not that far. For the
No.
most part, society itself had decided that certain aspects of our society were sort of agreed to. Like they were part, like if for a way of saying it, you might say, we know what it was to be Canadian in those scenarios. So the politics itself, the scope of politics, the range between the two wasn't that far. It was almost like tinkering around the edges. Some of it, obviously on one side was more, let's say, socially conservative or fiscally conservative. The other side might be more progressive and liberal, but the distance between the two wasn't that far.
Right.
And then almost, sort of post 9/11, the politics became about the notion of, well, I want the choice. Why is it that these parties are not, why is it that I can't really tell the difference between the two? But people overlook the notion of, well, because there's a layer on top of that, which is the country. Like there is British, there is Canadian, there's American. That does exist above the party system.
Yeah.
And saying, well, I want to have the choice between, on this one side, and then I want to see, 500 miles of sunlight between that and the other side, so that I know
Yeah.
that I have a real democratic choice, as opposed to saying,
Mm.
reflecting on the notion that we actually have a stable system, we have a stable society, one in which, yeah, we have differences, but
Yeah.
ultimately we have that identity that we go, yeah, I feel comfortable with 99% of everything, and the election can come down to like the 1% of
That's
differences.
yeah, that's really interesting. I found it really quite telling that in the last few years the word centralist has become an insult, and there are people out there who are on the right and they just want unfettered capitalism, and then there's people on the left who want unfettered socialism.
Yeah,
And if a left progressive party picks up any policy that those people regard as right wing, it's suddenly, oh, you're a red tie Tory, you are. And it's
yeah,
like, well, no, I don't. There's a gulf of difference between managing a country effectively in the world in which we exist and an ideological utopia that couldn't exist in
yeah,
the real world. And I think that's where things in the last few years have really fallen. The wheels have fallen off a little bit, especially in British politics, because the right has become so extreme, and for a few years there, the left were almost just as bad in the other direction, demanding purity tests. So on one hand, you had the Tories getting rid of 37 of their MPs because they didn't back the Brexit deal that
yeah.
Boris Johnson was pretending that he
And,
had, and then
and for the most part, they were moderates.
on the left, you had people who were screaming at people like me to f off and join the Tories
Yeah,
because we didn't want the flagship policy of the Conservative Party, Brexit, to happen.
yeah,
And I'm like, this is I'm losing it here. But I think this is something that Keir Starmer and his current team are doing really well, is sort of bringing it back towards the centre and appealing to people who might have otherwise voted Tory to either vote Labour. It's a bit of a long shot, but more importantly, perhaps, or more realistically, perhaps not bother voting in the next election.
yeah.
So, because that's
Well, this is
almost as
what I mean
good.
by the complacency, though, is that there is a complacency that comes with being in a stable democracy where you think, well, we can do whatever we want because ultimately the foundations are strong. Um, you know,
Mm,
we may have made that mistake when we approached the Brexit vote, was to say in or out, it's not going to matter. I mean, one of the issues that I did get blasted about was the notion of when I highlighted the risk to the Northern Irish peace agreement, was something that was definitely in the mix with regards to, well, if you leave the EU, the basis of being part of the EU meant that people in Northern Ireland don't have to choose between an Irish identity or a British one.
yeah,
And that's the basis of the Good Friday Agreement, what made it work. And, but it was a hard thing to strike, but it was also fragile. Even 20 years after the fact, it was still fragile.
yeah.
To risk it the way that it was done. Um, you know, I got some things wrong about those predictions in terms of what I had said in conversations with people, but ultimately, it did become the forefront of many of the internal issues that we were having, whether it be in Northern Ireland or within the larger conversation of the United Kingdom as a whole. And it remains the sticking point. Um, the Americans have said that there's no trade deal on the table. Um, I can only imagine, given the fact that they are one of the guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, They were one of the ones that brokered peace. Um, you know, Bill Clinton was standing there when it was agreed to,
Yeah.
and gave a speech, to commemorate it. And you sit there going, yeah, America's not fond of people who risk peace. Um, which,
Yes.
again, I fully recognize some
Ironic.
people might, yeah, some people might sit there and go, well, that's a bit rich.
Yeah.
But
But
again,
yeah,
again,
so
like,
essentially you're saying that boredom is the greatest killer of stable democracy, people
well,
in
look at the
general.
democracies that are
People get
fledgling.
bored. Yeah, they
Look at
get complacent, they get bored.
what happens in Ukraine. Like the people rallied around the notion they wanted to be a democratic state in the face of actual legitimate threat.
Yeah.
And you're not going to go in there and have people having, well, I just wish that the politicians were slightly different. I've seen opposition politicians in Ukraine fully back things coming out of Zelensky's office or through the Kiev government's office. The reason being is, well, there are legitimate problems they have that are plainly clear to see for everybody.
Yeah.
Um, they wish to be a democracy. They are going to have to earn it in terms of protecting themselves and reestablishing an environment where they can have a democratic and open and free society.
Yeah.
For those of us that enjoy that as a matter of course, um, again, I grew up in Canada. Not many people will turn around and look at Canada and go, oh, well, I'm not really sure they're democratic. Um, a lot of people go, oh, well, that's a very peaceful, polite society. Oh, we have our differences, but the extremes that start to emerge, whether it's here in Britain, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in America,
Yeah.
the extremes that have emerged have been such as to render suspicion, cynicism, um, and a lack of dialogue.
Yeah.
So, in your intro of me, you said I focus on international law and democracies. Um, I look at self-determination and independence referendums, and a big question I ask is, why is it that a lot of places are afraid to have existential questions as a society? You know, we should not be
Yeah.
afraid to have conversations with each other, but we should also not demonize the entire spectrum. Now, there's always going to be extremes. The goal is let's get a stable core. So in the
Well,
UK, I'd like to
yeah.
see a more centrist thing. And as you said, when I see the policies that Keir Starmer's pursuing, do I agree with 100% of them? Absolutely not. Do I look at them and I go, well, this is more reasonable and more towards a central core that we can gravitate to politically across the spectrum? Yes, I do think that that's a much more inviting um, conversation
Yeah.
than if we're going to sit here and say, well, let's deport asylum seekers to Rwanda in violation of international law, or
Yeah.
yeah, you know what? Let's violate the Brexit, the exiting the EU agreement in violation of international law.
Yeah.
I sit there and
Yeah.
go like, why are we having
Well,
these
Labour are
conversations?
not calling for the end of the European Convention of Human Rights. The Labour are not calling for strikes to be impossible. They're not calling for a lot of the social, what's it called, the cultural bollocks of the Tory party like to go along with. One thing I want to pick up on when you were talking about
Mm.
complacency. So I think hand in hand in that is the demographics shift that we've had. Sorry, we're getting a little bit away from the law here, but
No, no, no.
the demographic shift in that, but in both the US and the UK, the millennials and the Generation Z or Generation Z are both. Is it? Do you say Z or Z in Canada?
Oh, Zed. There's only one
Z.
way to say it properly.
Oh, fantastic. Good. Anyway, so millennials and Generation Z are becoming more left wing as they get older. And one of the reasons for this, and also a reason why the older millennials, the geriatric millennials, as, thanks for that, as they're
I can't
called.
wait for my call from my family going, am I one of those? And I'll be like, yes.
Well, apparently the number of people having a midlife crisis in their sort of late 30s, early 40s is decreasing massively. And I think one of the reasons for it is because so many people in our generation and the generations coming up have just lurched from crisis to crisis, from the election of Bush to the 9/11 to Afghanistan, Iraq, the credit crunch, ISIS, Syria, the Brexit vote, the election of Trump, the COVID
Pandemic.
pandemic,
Yep.
the invasion of Ukraine. Like it just doesn't stop, and so they haven't had the chance to become complacent because of the economic factors. They haven't had a chance to settle down and have a family. They haven't had a chance to buy a house. They haven't had a chance to get their feet under the table and get bored enough to want to go and have a midlife crisis. So I think there might be this might be a
It's an interesting
huge
theory. Yeah.
change over the next 20 years as we see people in certain countries appreciating democracy more. But at the same time as this is happening, younger people in other countries like France, Spain, Italy, Hungary, Poland are going more to the right. And you might be, when you're mentioning complacency, you see how many people are voting for Marine Le Pen in France in these presidential elections, and it's,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
squeaky bum time. 1 in 3.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that should always be remembered is that you can have all the predictions in the world. The only ones that ever matter are the actual elections. And I don't think it's a foregone conclusion in any society that you know which way it's going to go.
Mm.
You know, incorporating how I personally feel in certain situations. I've seen enough elections or votes go the opposite way to only to have what I consider to be reasonable hope. Brexit was a bit of a shock. I'm not going to lie. I stayed up with a number of colleagues discussing it as the votes rolled in, and
Yeah.
my partner, she said to me, "Well, I'm going to go to bed because once the first result came in, she went, well, that doesn't bode well." She goes, "I'll find out in the morning." And sure enough, I'm sitting there kind of going, all I did was give myself disappointment, and I was exhausted for another day because I'd stayed up to watch this. And but in terms of the demographic shift, yeah, you know what? I think another aspect you might want to roll into that is the idea of the speed of which information comes to people.
Yes.
You know, are people getting more progressive as they get older? I think I would disagree with you on the notion of getting more, but I would definitely say that, you know, there's a saying that basically says, like, you must be a liberal in your youth. You must be progressive in your youth because that's the nature of it. But if you're still a liberal when you're older, cynically it says that you haven't figured it out yet. That you're supposed to get conservative as you get older. I
Yeah,
disagree with
because you're
that.
supposed to have amass some wealth that you then want to protect by not having to pay tax and
I
taking
think
the
they're
ladder
more.
away from others. So yeah,
I
but
think they're I think
those
they're less.
generations had a chance to do that. In the UK, I think it's 90% of the wealth in the UK is currently in the hands of the baby boomer generation.
Yeah, but again, I don't think it's just about wealth. I think there's also this
Oh
notion
yeah,
that
yeah.
the position that's taken in that particular saying is one in which it says, well, you learn over time, and as you get more experience, the more you become less radicalized or less progressive because you sit there and say, oh, maybe things are, maybe we should take things a little slower, and you become conservative.
I
But
think
I
that's
will say
very
that,
kind, George. I'd just say you just become a selfish bastard the older you get.
oh, I'm getting long in the tooth myself, so I guess I'll put that to the test. But I'll definitely say that I think that it's persisting longer.
Yeah.
I think that point at which one re-examines their like their position on the political spectrum um, used to be around just above where I am right now. Mid 40s. It coincided with having family, possessing property, having a home, having assets. As you say, it, I don't think it's so much as being selfish as much as it is being pragmatic about, you've worked hard to get X, you need to protect X, whether that
Yes.
be family, property, whatever. I think the reality is that the threats and the concerns that we have now, we're more across the board and being familiar with the risks around the world.
Yeah.
You know, um, we find out about things in real time.
Yeah.
Um,
But also, I mean, when I was a kid, we grew up with the existential threat of nuclear war. In the 80s, it was a real thing. We watched shows like Threads and films like When the Wind Blows, and it was bloody
War games.
terrifying. Yeah, war games. It was a terrifying prospect that everything you know and love could be taken from you next day, and we had a good.
Yeah, but you would have a 30-minute window before you found out.
Oh, good.
Nowadays, that launch would occur,
Make myself a
and it would be
sandwich.
across social media that a missile has been launched, and you would know about it
Yeah.
within 15 seconds or 30 seconds, and then the next 29 minutes and 30 seconds, you get to live with that existential reality of going, it's over in 29 minutes. I think I've got enough time for an episode of Friends on Channel 4.
And then the internet's not working because everyone's texting people. But
Exactly.
yeah, I mean that's true. But what I was going to say is, when I say we're lurching from crisis to crisis, the overarching crisis over all of this is climate change. And there are a lot of people I know in my generation who are just like, this is awful. We're doing nothing about it. We've known about this for 50 freaking years now, and we're
Mhm.
still doing nothing about it. Nowhere near as much as we need to be doing. And when the government's tackled about this, say, we had a meeting. We had a very successful meeting, and I'm like, it's good enough. But yeah, just before we wrap up, because we have been going now for nearly an hour. Just to go back to the legal issues with what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, with the Cabinet Office versus the inquiry. So,
Okay, so
what
they're doing,
are the permutations? Can the Cabinet Office take the inquiry to a judicial review to decide? How does it work? Just explain it to me like I'm an idiot.
So essentially, it comes down to the nature of the challenge that the Cabinet Office made. So a notice was served on the Cabinet Office. They had the opportunity to bring a challenge to that, which
When
they
you say
did.
a notice, George, does that have any legal weight to it, or is it just a request?
Yeah, so that comes under, it's called a Section 21 notice. It's under the Inquiries Act 2005. Essentially, this is the powers of the chair of an inquiry to compel the production of evidence that they feel is relevant to the scope of their investigation. And essentially, it still permits under, I think it's Section 21(4), where an individual who has received such a notice has certain reasons why they can't produce, or they feel that it's unreasonable to produce. They can submit a response to the notice to that chair to say, these are the reasons why I cannot comply with your notice, with your request for information. Ultimately, it's for the chair to decide whether or not those reasons are legitimate. She, in this instance, Baroness Hallett has ruled that it's not. So the reasoning being that she gave centers around the notion that the nature of the objection being made is the result of a much larger objection that's being made that isn't within the scope of a Section 21(4) response. And Baroness Hallett has actually said the appropriate forum, should you wish to pursue these objections, isn't through a response to me, but is a judicial review. And that's what the Cabinet Office is doing. They're saying, okay, well, we lost our application to her. She dismissed the application by the Cabinet Office, which was within her powers to do. With regards to the objections substantively made, that has to be done through judicial review, as per Baroness Hallett suggesting so. And the Cabinet Office is taking them up on that and saying, right, we'll take this to judicial review. The wisdom of that, I've seen many different, practicing barristers, very respected barristers, having different opinions. It should be noted that the submission that was made to the inquiry was written by very respected barristers as well, who offered legal opinions as to why they wouldn't comply with the notice. It'll be interesting to see. It will go to the court, and I tend to side with the ones that say, to be honest with you, I think the court will side with Baroness Hallett.
Yeah.
But I am particularly interested to see the arguments made on both sides.
So Baroness Hallett, she can't use the law to compel them to hand over this documentation. So it goes to judicial review, and both parties come into that judicial review. Is that how it works? No. It's not like being sued and countersued. It's a bit different.
It's judicial review of the powers that she has. So the accusation from the Cabinet Office is that she's acting what's called ultra vires, outside of her powers under the Inquiries Act. Her position is one that she is legally entitled to exercise these powers, and that the difference of opinion here is one in which the Cabinet Office says you're restricted to anything specifically related to COVID-19. She's saying the scope and nature of this inquiry is such that it's very, very broad by its nature, that it's going to involve discussions about things. And for instance, she gives the example of it's important for us to understand where a failure to make a decision might have occurred because a certain cabinet minister may have been distracted by other decisions that they were making or other conversations they were having. And in order to understand why that failure occurred, we need to have an overall global context of what was going on involving these individuals. And we can only do that by seeing it. Now, she will necessarily, if it is provided unredacted, you also have to trust. I mean, she was a court of appeal judge. She knows how to handle sensitive information. She knows that she's going to limit who actually is involved in determining what is relevant and what is not. But it's for her to determine, and that's her position. So they'll go to judicial review. They'll ask, does she have, do her powers under the Inquiries Act essentially permit her to compel the government, the Cabinet Office, the government, to produce as broad a request as she has, or has she overstepped her bounds by suggesting that rather than a tailored request for information, that she can request all WhatsApp communications and all notebooks involving this, and that she's the one who will go and redact through what will see the public think. One last thing I will add as well is that the inquiry itself is not subject to freedom of information requests.
Oh,
So
right. Okay. So if they find something out, I can't write them a letter to say, hey, tell me
they're
all
not.
about these secret
The
deals
FOI
for PPE.
requests don't apply to an inquiry of this
Oh,
sort. That's referred
interesting.
to in the documentation as well. And I'm happy to send. I'm happy to send the documents your way or the links to the documents so you can see them yourself. But
So,
it's all spelled out there.
okay, so goes to judicial review. How long is this going to take? Is this something that's going to be wrapped up in the next couple of weeks, or is this something that's just going to go on and on and on?
I mean, I would have. I imagine that there's probably some sort of impetus to get this done fairly quickly.
Yeah.
This is a judicial review of a decision. The scope of the decision kind of determines how long it's going to take to get forward. But I can't imagine it's going to take far too long. The other thing is that there's a public interest in the proper administration of the inquiry, in understanding how far they actually do have the powers to do things. It's in the interest of the Cabinet Office to have an answer as well.
Yes. And
But
also, it's in my interest. I don't want to get bored of waiting. Because you know what happens when people get bored? They vote for Trump and Brexit and all kinds of crazy shit.
Oh yeah, no, I mean across the board, people do some crazy things.
Boredom is one of the biggest killer of human beings. I swear. So no one should ever retire.
Well, hopefully I haven't bored. Hopefully I haven't bored you. I haven't bored.
Not at all. Not at all. I could go on, but we have been talking now for over an hour, so we should probably wrap it up about there. But would you be willing to come on again in the future and we'll talk some more legal stuff?
You name the day and time, and I'll be there, brother.
Excellent. Thank you, George. Okay, so thank you for watching. This has been The Agenda on Labour Social. Until next time, hello, good evening, welcome, and goodbye.